A secret between steel and skin. The first time Officer Mara Hendricks looked at inmate 4471, she told herself it was just routine, a standard sweep of the eyes that every corrections officer learns to perform without feeling anything. But the woman sitting alone in the far corner of the recreation yard, with her knees pulled to her chest and a dog-eared paperback balanced on her thigh, was not someone you could look at without feeling something. Her name, according to the file, was Delilah Cross, 29 years old, convicted of fraud, 18 months remaining on a 3-year sentence. On paper, she was just another number, but paper has never been able to hold the weight of a human soul. And Delilah Cross had a soul that seemed too large, too luminous for the gray concrete walls that surrounded her. Mara had been working at Harrow Creek Correctional Facility for 6 years. She had built her life around discipline, early mornings, pressed uniforms, a rigid schedule that left no room for ambiguity. She was respected by her colleagues and feared, in a quiet way, by most of the women in her unit. She had learned early that distance was not cruelty. It was survival. You could not do this job and let the walls between you and the inmates dissolve. That was what they taught you in training, and Mara had believed it with the kind of conviction that people reserve for things they need to be true. She had never questioned it. Not until the afternoon in early November, when Delilah Cross dropped her book in the yard and looked up to find Mara already watching her. And instead of looking away, Delilah simply smiled, and not the guarded, performative smile of someone managing a guard, but something softer and more startling, like sunlight finding a crack in a boarded-up window. Mara looked away first. She told herself it meant nothing, but the days had a way of accumulating. Harrow Creek was a world of repetition. The same bells, the same corridor walks, the same faces in the same plastic chairs. And within that repetition, Mara began to notice Delilah the way you notice a single melody threaded through background noise. She noticed that Delilah was always reading, always quietly, always alone, not out of rejection but out of preference. She noticed that the other women respected her in a wordless way. That argument softened when Delilah placed herself near them. She noticed that Delilah never complained, not even when the heat in Block C failed for 4 consecutive days in January and the women slept in their coats. There was a steadiness to her that Mara found, against every professional instinct she owned, deeply moving. The library was where it truly began. Harrow Creek had a library, 2 shelves of donated paperbacks and a table, with a crack down the middle, that Mara was assigned to supervise on Thursday afternoons. For the first 3 weeks, Delilah came and read in silence, and Mara stood by the door and watched the clock. Then one Thursday, Delilah set down her book and said, quietly, without looking up, that the ending of the novel she was reading had made her cry, and she wasn't sure if that meant it was a great book or a manipulative one. She didn't say it to Mara specifically. She seemed to say it to the room, but Mara answered. She said she thought books that made you cry were the only ones worth reading, because they were the only ones brave enough to tell the truth. Delilah looked up then, and the expression on her face was one of pure, unguarded surprise, as if she had not expected Mara to have an interior life, as if she had forgotten that the uniform was covering a person. That conversation lasted 4 minutes. Mara counted. She spent the rest of the week trying not to think about it and thinking about nothing else. What grew between them over the following months was not reckless or dramatic. It was quiet and careful and terrifying in the way that quiet things can be terrifying, like ice forming over deep water, invisible until you are already standing on it. They talked about books, and then about childhood, and then, in the slow way that trust builds between people who have learned not to trust easily, about the things that had broken them. Delilah talked about the desperate financial spiral that had led to her crime, a sick mother, a predatory employer, a choice made in panic that she would spend the rest of her life measuring the cost of. Mara talked about the loneliness she had constructed around herself like a fort, believing it was protection, slowly understanding it was a prison of its own kind. They talked in low voices during library hours, in the careful language of people who understood that every word between them was a risk. Mara did not name what she felt for a long time. She was 34 years old and had spent most of her adult life in a profession that rewarded hardness, in a family that had no language for the kind of woman she was. She had buried that part of herself so thoroughly that she had almost convinced herself there was nothing there to bury. But Delilah had a way of looking at her, direct and unhurried, like she was reading something important that made all of Mara's architecture feel temporary. She began to understand with a slow and frightening clarity that what she felt was not admiration or professional sympathy or the complicated pity that sometimes moved through her when she thought about the women in her care. It was something older and more dangerous than any of those things. It was love. She knew what it meant. She knew the regulations she would be violating, the career she would be risking, the judgment she would face from every direction if anyone ever found out. She knew that Delilah was in a position of profound vulnerability, that the power imbalance between them was real and consequential, and could not simply be wished away by the sincerity of her feelings. She wrestled with this in the sleepless hours before dawn, lying in her apartment with the ceiling pressing down on her like a verdict. She told herself to transfer out of Block C. She told herself to stop going to the library on Thursdays. She told herself that feelings were not actions and that she was strong enough to keep them locked behind the same walls she had built around everything else. She was not strong enough. It was not a kiss that undid her. It was a moment in March when Delilah was called into the warden's office over a minor paperwork discrepancy that should have taken 10 minutes but stretched into 2 hours, and when she came out, her face was pale and tight, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been reminded once again that they have no power over their own life. Mara was in the corridor. Their eyes met, and without thinking, without planning, Mara said her name, just Delilah, in a tone of voice she had never used inside those walls, a tone that was soft and certain and full of everything she had spent months trying to keep contained. Delilah stopped walking. The corridor was empty. The moment stretched between them like held breath, and Delilah said very quietly that she had known and that she felt it too, and that she was more frightened of it than she had ever been of anything in her life, and that she thought about it every single day. They did not touch. They stood 3 feet apart in a fluorescent-lit corridor and told each other the truth, and it was the most intimate thing Mara had ever experienced. What followed was a kind of love that existed entirely in restraint and glances and careful words. In the books Delilah left open to certain passages that she knew Mara would read when she reshelved them, in the way Mara always ensured that Delilah's requests for additional reading materials were approved without delay, in the small dignities she preserved for her when the system offered none. It was a love that understood its own impossibility and chose to exist anyway, quietly and without demand, like a plant growing through concrete, finding light in the only spaces available to it. But the world inside Harrow Creek was not built for privacy. A fellow officer named Reyes began watching Mara with narrowed eyes, began timing how long she spent in the library, began asking questions wrapped in casual conversation that Mara could feel the danger inside. She started pulling back. She stopped the Thursday conversations. She made herself cold and procedural in Delilah's presence, and she watched the careful neutrality fall over Delilah's face like a shutter closing, and it cost her more than she could measure. She told herself she was protecting Delilah. She told herself that whatever they were to each other, the most loving thing she could do was create distance. 3 weeks before Delilah's release date, Mara requested a transfer to the morning shift at the opposite end of the facility. She told herself it was the right thing. She told herself love was not always about staying close. Sometimes it was about making sure the other person got out of the burning building, even if it meant you stayed inside. On Delilah's last morning at Harrow Creek, Mara was not supposed to be in the East Processing Wing. There was no professional reason for her to be there, but she was, standing near the far wall with her hands at her sides and her face composed into the careful blankness she had spent 6 years perfecting. As Delilah Cross signed her release papers and collected her belongings and moved toward the door that would give her back her life, Delilah paused at the threshold. She didn't look around the room. She looked directly at Mara, across the distance between them with the same steady, unhurried gaze she had been using since that first afternoon in the yard. She didn't smile. She just looked for a long, full moment like she was memorizing something. Then she walked through the door into the pale morning light and she was gone. Mara stood in the empty corridor for a long time after. She thought about all the ways love could exist in the world. The loud, celebrated kinds and the ones that never get named. The ones that live entirely in restraint and sacrifice and the aching space between what you feel and what you are allowed to do. She thought about what it meant to love someone when the world provided no container for that love. She thought about how much courage it takes to feel something fully and still choose the other person's freedom over your own. 6 months later, a letter arrived at Mara's apartment. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. Careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned to be precise with the little space they were given. The letter was short. It said that the writer had found a job and was taking care of her mother and was reading more books than ever, and that she thought about certain corridors and certain Thursday afternoons more often than was probably wise, and that she hoped the person reading this letter had found a way to let some light in. It was signed simply with the initial D. Mara read it 4 times. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming and complicated relief of being known by someone, of having been seen truly and fully, even in a place built to make people invisible. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you believe that love finds its way even through the most impossible walls, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like these deserve to be heard, and your support makes it possible to keep telling them. Before we close, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what this story made you feel, or share a time when you witnessed love survive in the most unexpected place. Your words matter more than you know. Some loves are never spoken aloud. Some loves exist only in a look held a breath too long, in a name said with too much softness, in a letter with no return address arriving like a small miracle on an ordinary morning. But they are no less real. They are no less worthy. And the people who carry them, quietly at great cost, with tremendous dignity, are braver than any story has ever been able to fully say.